Tony Blair, thanks for joining us at HuffPost UK.
Thank you, Paul.
There's a brilliant Matt cartoon in the Telegraph over the weekend where he's got a newsreader announcing that the clocks go forward 1 hour this weekend, but don't forget to put your Brexit clocks back by 12 months. Is a long delay to Brexit now inevitable, and is it the best solution, or would it lead to more uncertainty?
It's the best solution to have a proper extension where we can, with time and space, run through the various options on Brexit, get Parliament to come to a conclusion, then decide whether the final say is given to the people or not. So it's a good thing to do. I think it's the only way that we're going to bring any form of certainty to the process. And hopefully after this week, this is what the Prime Minister and Parliament will come to.
What do you make of the fact that Emmanuel Macron, for example, says we'd no way accept an extension without a clear objective? And Michel Barnier has said we don't need time, we need decisions. I mean, what do you make of that approach from Brussels and from
They're 100% right, by the way, in this sense, that there's no point in having more time just to carry on in the same way we've been in the last few months. But here's the thing that they want and that we should want as well. You should have an extension for a purpose, and the purpose should come with a plan. And the plan should be to take Parliament through the options in a way that's not really been done in this last 2 to 3 years, where you set out the various options, which are, by the way, absolutely clear and aren't really a matter of negotiation. They're more a matter of choice, frankly. And then Parliament has got to come to a decision which of those options it wants, and then decide, as I say, whether to have a confirmatory referendum. You put the matter, give the final say to the British people. But, you know, I totally understand the argument that says, well, look, if they haven't come to an agreement in these last few weeks, why should they come to an agreement over a period of months? And the answer is because I think the psychology of Parliament will shift in a very clear way if the government then grips the indicative vote process, and in a sense, if the Prime Minister becomes the facilitator and the arbiter, the referee, if you like, of this process, and says, look, here are the options, and those who are arguing for a hard Brexit, like Boris Johnson and others, right, here's what we believe it means, and you input into that if you're telling us it means something different. Here's what a customs union means. Here's what a single market means, and we've got to decide. And, you know, in the end, I think for members of Parliament, if you give them that process, ultimately, because they're discussing and debating this the whole time, they will come to a conclusion. And what's been, I think, very sad about this situation is that the public are getting mobilised in a way against Parliament. And this is both dangerous and profoundly wrong, because actually what's happening is that members of Parliament are realising there are all sorts of different forms of Brexit with very different consequences for the economy and living standards and their constituents. And therefore, absolutely rightly, they're saying we've got to have a way of going through these different choices and coming to a conclusion. And the fact is, they've not been allowed to do this until Parliament gripped the process. But this is pretty rushed, and I really counsel against this week snatching at a solution, like, say, the customs union, and voting that through, because believe me, it needs a lot more in-depth analysis and information put before people before they make a decision like that.
And do you think 12 months as an extension is realistic? Do you think it's long enough? Do you think it might take 2 years, some people suggesting, for this process to play out properly?
I don't think it need take even as long as a year. And by the way, it could happen within a few months. You might request a longer extension with the ability to shorten it. The other thing to understand is that I think in retrospect, and indeed I think some have actually said this at the time, it was not sensible to have such a strong distinction between the negotiation period for the withdrawal agreement and then this 19-month, 18-month or 21-month extension period. So we were supposed to leave March 29th, 2019. We would then have a transition up to the end of 2020. Any time that we take to extend the withdrawal period and the period where we're still in the EU, we should take off the transition period. You could do that perfectly easily because you're going to foreshorten the necessity for a transition period because you're actually going to reach a conclusion about the future relationship within this extended period. So I don't think it needs to be that long, but it needs to be long enough that you can run the conclusions and reach a proper decision.
And is Macron making a big mistake in suggesting no deal Brexit actually is preferable to more uncertainty?
Yeah, he's not really suggesting that. What President Macron is saying perfectly sensibly is there's no point in having more time unless it's to reach a conclusion. And I think everyone agrees with that. The question is the process to get there. And the thing that I think people find difficult is they think, well, how come you now want a different process? But the truth is, we've never really had a process in which also the public is involved in understanding what the difference is between these forms of Brexit. Because, you know, for a large part of the public, they're sitting there saying, look, we voted for this, and why haven't you done it? It's completely understandable, except that the different forms of Brexit are very different. And what we've really been having is a process where the government's been trying to push this deal, which people in Parliament haven't really wanted for, in my view, very good reasons. And therefore, it's only literally within the last couple of weeks or so we've got a grip on this indicative vote process.
And so do you agree with those people who suggest that Prime Minister Letwin has done more in 2 days than Prime Minister May has done in 2 years?
Well, look, at one level I completely understand Theresa May's position. I think she genuinely, by the way, has been trying to do her best for the country. It's that it's very hard because I think the beginnings of understanding on this are to realise I don't think there is a Brexit compromise that will heal the country. Because in the end, I think there are quite binary choices around Brexit. I think there is a process that can heal the country. I think if we tumbled out now with a kind of botched deal that people didn't really want, supposing she manages to get over the line with her deal, with people saying things like, right, I'm voting for this, although it's a rotten deal, this is not sensible. And that's not going to heal the country, because let's be clear, we've paid a lot of attention to the people who voted leave, rightly, because they were in the majority in the referendum. But if I was in politics frontline today, you know, that march, more than that, the 6 million people who signed the petition, I mean, if I was a Conservative member of Parliament, I would think long and hard before pushing the government over the line on a deal where people who voted Remain and who've watched this process and seen the mess that we're in are going to feel a real sense of anger if the country leaves Europe with a botched deal that no one really wants in circumstances where, you know, this is just deciding the entirety of our future.
So you think the Tory party will pay at the ballot box if that does happen?
Absolutely. I think they'll pay very heavily. I mean, I think if I was in the Tory party today, I would really worry at the degree to which the Tory party is becoming defined as a narrow nationalist party. And it's much of the same phenomenon as has driven the vote for Donald Trump in the United States. But the decision is one that is permanent. And so the Republicans are in enough sort of difficulty and turmoil over what's happened in the United States. But for the Conservative Party here, because it's a life-changing decision for the country, I mean, do they really want to alienate all of those people who voted Remain, and who, by the way, are not sitting there feeling that the whole thing's turned out well? They're sitting there thinking, it's a complete mess, and with this mess and this magnitude of decision making, these guys are going to force us to carry on and do this without us at least having a final say on it.
And if there is an extension, we get the big problem of Euro elections, Britain taking part in them. How should the parties approach that? I mean, for example, how would the Labour Party campaign in a European election that it actually at the last election said it didn't want?
Yeah, look, the European elections, holding them is not ideal, but then nothing's ideal about this situation. But I don't think, we should be terrified of the thought of having the European elections. There are, I think, technical ways that this could be circumvented. And I think it's also not necessarily the case that we have to have the elections on the timetable that Europe's suggesting. But that's, these are technical and legal arguments that have got to be explored. if we have the European elections, well, the sensible thing for the Labour Party to do is to set out its policy, which is that if we can't reach a consensus, we go for a people's vote, a referendum. I mean, I think that would be that is the policy of the Labour Party, as far as I can work it out clearly. That is the policy. It would certainly be sensible for the Labour Party to do that. And one of the things I find odd about this is those people who were so keen to talk about the will of the people, they seem extraordinarily reluctant to go and test that will again, either in the European elections or in another referendum. And one thing I've never understood is what is undemocratic about saying, after all this exploration and difficulty, we need to make sure that the will of the people is the same as it was back in June 2016, because there's so much more information before us. It's a curious thing to describe it as undemocratic, to go back and ask people again in circumstances where even the most ardent Brexiteer would have to accept this process has been a complete mess.
And the independent group of MPs, which is made up of former Conservative and former Labour MPs, they are going to contest these Euro elections if they do happen, under the name of Change UK Party. Now, do you think that's a good name? And do you think they've got a chance in those elections?
I don't know whether it's a good name or not, but yeah, I mean, they will get support, I should think. I don't know. It's hard to judge, and they're very new. But, I've said this before, and I say it again. If the two main parties stay, the Labour Party with a far left position that I think is a kind of left form of conservatism, frankly, and, the Tories retreat into this narrow lager of right-wing nationalism, you've got a large amount of territory that's uninhabited, and the independent group have moved into it. Okay, they're not large in number, but there's a lot of people in the country right now who don't feel very satisfied by either political party. I think this is clear.
So the European elections could be a big opportunity for them, potentially.
It could be. I mean, I think it will. I mean, obviously, there's going to be a lot more interest in them than ever before if they happen. But if they happen, they happen, and I don't quite understand why people are afraid of doing it. I mean, in the end, it's a very odd thing when people argue about a long extension, and they say, well, if you have a long extension, then Brexit might not happen. And I will say to them, well, why is that? And the reality is, the reason they think it might not happen is that with a long extension and a real exploration of the options, they think that people will, in fact, in the end, change their minds. And my point is, if that is where the British people are, why wouldn't we want to find out and to do it?
Now, if Brexit does ever happen, if the Prime Minister gets a deal over the line somehow, or if some other means that Brexit actually finally does get delivered in Britain, will the UK ever rejoin the EU in your lifetime, do you think? Do you think that there is inevitability to that, given the huge number of young people who are really, really keen on European membership? And do you think it would happen?
I think it's really difficult to judge, but my instinct is that it wouldn't.
Really?
And it's interesting if you talk to people with real life experience of the Norway relationship with Europe. The trouble is, once we come out of Europe, your relationship with them changes in a significant way. And yes, we will carry on, of course, having to deal with Europe a lot of the time, but our relationship will be very much one of supplicant, and they will be anxious all the time that we are trying to steal competitive advantage in some way, and it will just become a scratchy and difficult relationship. Now, I may be wrong in that, but
And that's not a basis for going back in?
No, because in the end, look, I understand, the people who want a soft Brexit now, because they say if you do a soft Brexit, then what happens is you can go back in at a later time. I'm really sceptical about that. And, half of me thinks if you're going to do Brexit, do it. And then you're going to have to forge a new future for yourself. And there can be areas of real cooperation with Europe, but the relationship you're going to have to accept is going to be very, very deeply different. And one of the reasons I am so passionately opposed to Brexit is not actually to do with the economics. I think in the end, yes, I think for sure the essential dishonesty of the Brexiteers is to pretend that you can have a painless way of getting out of the trading relationships that govern 60% of your trade, and you're not going to have an economic downside. You'll have a painful process of adjustment if you do that. But you can adjust over time if that's where you want to go. My reason is as much political, because all the time the world I'm seeing is a world that's going to be dominated by the middle of this century by 2, probably 3 big giants who are going to be America, China, and probably India. And those giants will be far ahead of any other country in size and weight and influence. And then you'll have some tall countries, but they're a lot smaller than the giants. But those will be Japan and Indonesia probably, because it's 3 times the population of Germany, Brazil, so on. Okay, then you're going to have the medium-sized countries. That's us, France, Italy, Germany. You know, in a land of giants, if we're on our own, we're going to get sat on. So if you want to preserve your power and influence and weight, you've got to be together. That's the reason for the European Union. And you don't have to think that everything is right about Europe. There are masses of things that should change in Europe. But the essential rationale for Europe today is about power and not just peace. And that rationale is going to get stronger and stronger. And honestly, I just tell people, having been in Prime Minister for 10 years, in a world of giants, and I know this, you know, I had a strong relationship with the United States, but I would never want to leave us solely with that relationship. The European relationship is also an important part of our power and our influence. And giving that up is a big, big mistake for a country like this.
There's a lot of talk about a possible general election in the air. The Cabinet are discussing it, the Labour Party are discussing it, demanding it. Should Labour's manifesto policy be for a second referendum? I mean, it's not set in stone. That manifesto process, as you know, hasn't even started until a general election. Keir Starmer would clearly like to see a second referendum as a manifesto commitment.
Yeah,
would you?
Yeah, of course, I'd like to see that too. But
do you think that is what might happen, or do you think there may be Jeremy Corbyn and other people may stop that from happening?
It's hard to judge, because I think the Labour Party's membership is pretty unified on Europe. It's not unified on a lot, but it is pretty unified on Europe. And, you know, I've always said this to people, that your risk is, if you try and ride both horses at once, Leave and Remain, you'll end up, you know, in a very uncomfortable position. And I think we have ended up in an uncomfortable position. And constructive ambiguity has long since, you know, been replaced by destructive indecision, which has only recently, I think, been mitigated by the fact the leadership has stepped forward. However, I don't see a general election happening. I would be extremely surprised if you're the Conservative Party and you go for a general election. I mean, I know this is today's politics and everything's a little mad, but you would have to be certifiable as a Conservative MP to want a general election in circumstances where you'd be fighting it under the shadow of Brexit. I mean, on what rational basis would you think that's a wise idea? When you might think, if Brexit's out of the way and you're fighting the Labour Party on normal domestic policy, you would have a reasonable chance. You fight the Labour Party with Brexit hanging over the election, then, as happened last time, there are a whole lot of reasons for people to vote Labour that they wouldn't have otherwise.
Now, there's some people in the Labour Party who suggest that actually, if the general election does take place much further in the future, say 2021, 22, that's the point at which Labour, if Brexit has already happened, Labour could really pull the country together with a manifesto pledge for a second referendum. Or do you think it'd be too late once Brexit has happened?
Yeah, once Brexit's happened now.
That's it.
I think, honestly, it is it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I actually just think politically, if you went, the country already, I mean, look, this isn't going to happen. But if Parliament woke up tomorrow and revoked, if they actually did it, okay, there would be a lot of protests, but there would also be a huge sigh of relief from many parts of the country, partly because there's a whole group of people, I think, whatever they think about Brexit, they just want the agony to end. Okay, and that's one of the reasons, by the way, that's frankly been the best reason for supporting her deal. Not one that I agree with, but that is that is how she's tried to drive the deal through Parliament. If you went back after we'd done Brexit and said, no, we're going to bring all this back again, I think the country would say, oh, no, please, we've had enough. That's why, this is why we're sensible to get a long extension. You need the long extension because it's all that will bring clarity to the choices. Once you have clarity, you will actually have a choice. Once you have a choice, you will have closure. And it's closure that people want, but you can't get the closure unless you have a process that will heal by being seen to be fair, laying out all the options, the government running it, not just Parliament, but government running this process of going through each of the options, explaining what they all mean, coming to a clear decision. That's what will get you.
And then putting that back to the people. Is that a key part of that?
Personally, I think Parliament, once you force Parliament to a conclusion, right, they will realise that the harder form of Brexit, which is a Canada-style free trade agreement, is painful. The Norway or customs union type of arrangement is pointless because you're still tied to Europe but lose your say. And at that point, in my view, members of Parliament will realise the sensible thing is to share responsibility for this decision with the British people. The one thing that her deal, Theresa May's deal, has had going for it is actually that it is not making a decision about the future relationship. Now, that's the reason I oppose it, because I think it's very dangerous to leave before you've decided the central question, which is what is the future relationship? But MPs have been tempted to support her deal on the basis it kicks the can down the road and you can leave in the meantime. Right? I don't think that's sensible for all the reasons I've given. But for sure, in my view, if her deal is rejected rightly because it doesn't determine that, once you do determine it, you'll have a whole lot of different coalitions, and in the end, the MPs, if you force them to take a decision, they will, but they will by that time understand that whatever way they jump is going to be difficult, and it will actually at that point be in their interests to say, you know what, the final say should rest with you, the British people. And the other thing we find when we test this with groups and with people is if you say to them, look, we should just rerun the referendum, people recoil from that. If you say to them, Parliament will take a judgment and then you have the final say, that is a much more acceptable way of approaching the issue.
Now, can I ask you a little bit about the Labour Party? There are some in the party who say that the genie of a member-led Labour Party is out of the bottle. You can't put it back in the bottle. That actually you have to accept that a few 100,000 activists can determine the party's fate when it comes to millions of Labour votes. Now, when you were Labour leader, membership hit 400,000 at one point, I think 96 or 97. So it's possible to have a mass centrist Labour Party. Do you think that's the only way back for your kind of politics in the Labour Party, that centrist membership is the only route?
Probably, because I don't see what other route there is. The membership, you can't coexist for a long time with a membership in a different position from the members of Parliament. That can happen for a short time, but not over time. And so, yes, I guess that's true. Although I think the whole concept of the way you approach politics and political parties is different in an internet age. And I think the concept of party membership in this kind of rigid way is not. There's something very old-fashioned about the feel of it today. But the simple truth of the matter is the Labour Party's it's got to work out where it wants to stand. And my problem with the present leadership is really that I think they represent what I call a kind of left form of conservatism. The policies are, I don't think, really progressive. If you had 10 or 12 billion pounds to spend today, would you spend them on abolishing tuition fees, or would you spend them on early years education, particularly in the poorest parts of the country, which is the most progressive thing? Now, I would argue the latter, not the former. Likewise, for me, if you look at the biggest challenge that all modern developed countries are going to face is the technological revolution. This is going to change everything. One of the tragedies of Brexit is not its destructive impact, but its distractive impact. And this technological revolution, I think, is so underestimated by the world of politics, and partly because I'm outside and I'm seeing how the world is developing. This is going to change everything. It's going to change the way we live, the way we work, the way we think. It's going to be like the 21st century equivalent of the 19th century Industrial Revolution. And it will change politics and should change politics. Where is that debate in British politics today? It's not even there. So I think, my problem with the leadership is not, you can argue about whether it's extreme or it's not extreme and so on. And there are obviously profound differences I have in some of their policy positions. But overall, my biggest anxiety is that in a world that is changing fast, and when the sociology of politics is changing fast, we're locking ourselves into a backward-looking perspective that doesn't answer the big questions that are coming down the track at us.
Now, way before Jeremy Corbyn became Labour leader, back in 2014, you said a traditional left-wing party competes with a traditional right-wing party with a traditional result. We didn't get that traditional result in 2017, did we? Why do you think that was? Is that because governments tend to lose elections rather than oppositions win them? Or is there another explanation? Is it that actually Jeremy Corbyn caught the mood?
I think to a degree he did catch a mood at least. But I think there were other very special factors in the election. I mean, Brexit's one. There were people who voted Labour for a very simple reason, which is they thought was the best chance to stop Brexit, which indeed it was. I think the Tory campaign was, pretty inadequate. I don't think they'll fight another campaign like that. I think he doesn't, that politics, and you can see this in the US with the Democrats, you can see it all over the Western world today. There is a constituency for a revived form of traditional socialism. There's no doubt about that, but I am not sure that constituency will hang in there very long once they start to realize that actually it doesn't really provide answers to the problems of the country. And that's why I think in the end it's interesting that you have this sort of curious alliance, both sides of the Atlantic, between an older generation that have been arguing for a politics that's been out of fashion, all of their lives and suddenly is in fashion, unified with a young and highly committed and energized group of people who see in them people of principle and, want to be part of that. They've created this new coalition. But I just think it ends when you start to pose the really hard questions. And in a sense, what's happened for this coalition in the Labour Party is that I think it has broken apart a bit over Brexit. I think many of the young people that supported Jeremy Corbyn have seen the ambiguity over Brexit and thought, well, why? Surely it's obvious we should be part of Europe in the future, we should be internationalists. And then they find there's a sort of leftist isolationism that says, no, actually what we want to do is build socialism in one country. And so I think that coalition, I don't think it's very well grounded ultimately. And I think there is a different coalition you can build for today's world that would give you a progressive majority in the country, but it would be from a more, what I would call it's inadequate, these words actually, to describe what I mean, but it's in a more traditional, modern, progressive centre-left position.
You mentioned the Democrats in the US. Now, one of those young people that's really caught the imagination of many people in the States is Alex Ocasio-Cortez. Now, she's come up with this idea of a Green New Deal. You've been talking about climate change for a long time. Do you see anything in that New Deal that actually is quite attractive, or do you think that's part of that old politics you're talking about? Because it does involve taxes, it does involve a stimulus plan, or actually is it a smart new form of politics?
Well, she's extremely interesting and articulate and dynamic person, that's for sure. So the problem is, in politics there are two types of politics in the end. There's the politics that is a politics of protest, and there's the politics of government. And sometimes the one can lead to the other, but they have a different spirit to them. The Green New Deal is raising the issue that needs to be raised. But if you actually look at the detail of it, I think they're going to find they really struggle if you're a presidential candidate and you've signed up to it, because you're talking about making the US economy carbon free in 10 years and not doing it by market mechanisms. It's okay, but when you look at the implications of that, it's massive, and I'm not sure it's practical. So the problem is, and this is part of the problem with the modern populism, left and right, it's a bit like being in a room of people where I'm having a reasonable conversation with you, and then someone in another part of the room is throwing crockery against the wall and jumping up on the table and shouting, right? If you walk into that room, who's more interesting? Me and you having a reasonable conversation, or the person, setting the room on fire? But in the end, it's not government. Government is about difficult decisions. It's about practical solutions. It's about providing real answers that survive the clash with the real world. And that's a more difficult form of politics. But it's, in my view, the only way the progressives in the end win. They only win when they're grounded in, yes, having the right issues that you've raised, but policies that people think are practical in order to deliver them. Otherwise, what they worry is they're getting the politics of protest when they, in the end, instinctively know they need the politics of government.
You mentioned the politics of protest. I mean, the Iraq War famously had this huge march, massive march, right down the bottom of Downing Street. You could hear it from within the building, couldn't you, famously? To what extent can a march, can a protest change a Prime Minister's mind?
Well, it can do, of course.
Can it?
I mean, yeah, of course, it can influence you. And, look, it's another whole discussion about Iraq, but people forget that at the time, Parliament was actually heavily in favour of doing what we did. We won a big majority. We had a vote in Parliament. And, the fact is, yes, the country was divided, but these were extremely difficult decisions about the relationship with America, what we thought about the regime, and so on and so forth. But it's not that people don't listen to it. If you're Prime Minister and you've got that number of people out in the street, of course you've got to listen to it. And that's why I think, frankly, if I was the Prime Minister now, of course you should pay attention to that march, particularly as many of those people, you see that march and it's a very reasonable group of people.
Waitrose voters.
Well, if you're a Tory Prime Minister, almost particularly if you're a Tory Prime Minister, you've got to be looking at those people, and the 6 million, I think the 6 million that signed the petition is in a sense even as important as the march. I mean, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, but these things, in the end, I don't suggest that you can't have a government deciding according to the size of the demonstrations and so on, but of course you listen to it.
And on the Tories, would a Boris Johnson-led Tory party be a gift to the Labour Party or a real threat to the Labour Party?
It depends where we are. If we have I have absolutely no doubt that if you have a right-wing populism against a left-wing populism in this country, the right wing will win. So it depends where we stand. If we stand in a reasonable position where you will have many Conservative voters that will feel repelled by a Boris Johnson premiership, particularly after the party's played in Brexit, but you've got to be in a position where those people feel it's safe to vote for you. And you've got to remember that those people are people who voted Tory. They voted Tory. So I always used to say to people, people in the Labour Party used to say to me when I was leader, you're going too far to the centre to get these people. And I say, you've got to understand, these are people who voted Tory. So they voted Conservative. So you're not, if you put yourself in a position where you offer them a far left version of Labour, what makes you think they're going to go on that big a journey that fast? I mean, in the practical world of politics, no, you've got to be in a position where you say, look, we're going to shift the priorities of the government. We're going to focus much more on social justice, but we understand the need for competitive business. We understand the need to keep taxes within a reasonable frame. Then you can get those people with you. But you suddenly offer them a revolutionary alternative from the left. What makes you think that people who voted Tory are suddenly going to go for that? It's a bizarre analysis of their psyche. So if you have a Boris Johnson-led Conservative Party, I mean, you've got to say this to him. He's a formidable campaigner. He's an interesting personality. He can get out there and do his stuff for sure. But you've got to be in a position as a Labour Party where you're offering a sensible, coherent alternative that is different and progressive, but is going to provide the right receptacle for those votes of Tories who are going to say, well, if I've got any alternative that's reasonable to Boris Johnson, I'm going to take it because I feel very strongly about what he's done to the country.
Theresa May did something really historic this week. She decided she was going to quit as Prime Minister. Now, there was no election. This all happened in the 1922 committee, in the private room in the House of Commons. This massive, big decision. Now, you've been there before, people calling for you to go, or when are you going to go? She's finally announced it. Did you have any sympathy at all for the way in which she was forced to signal her departure?
Yeah, no, of course I do. And I've always said this, by the way, that at a personal level, I'm sympathetic to her. And by the way, I do not think this is the time to change Prime Minister. I don't think it's sensible to do that. I mean, if you end up injecting into this whole business, which is uncertain enough as it is, and where there is a sensible way out, which is for her to pivot to being the arbiter, the facilitator, the referee, and set out a proper process for decision, that is better, frankly, coming from the person who's Prime Minister at the moment than ending up with a Tory leadership election, which heaven knows what sort of madness that's going to produce, and then a general election at the end of it, which is going to prolong the uncertainty. No, I think, I feel sympathetic to her, of course, at a personal level, but the fact is that this decision is so big for the country. I mean, it is it is the biggest decision we've taken since the end of the Second World War. And you've only got to put it in that way to realise that the size of the decision, the importance of it, the difference it's going to make to future generations means that you can't, whatever sympathy, I may feel for her personally, this is something that's got to be got right. And if you believe it's a profound mistake, as I do, then you should do everything you can to stop it. If in the end the country decides, I mean, my view is, look, if the country, you give them a chance to think again and they say, no, we're going to tell you again, then that's it. Then from that, the day after that's done, we've got to roll up our sleeves and get to work and forge a new future for ourselves. But I don't think, for people like me, we're not going to feel this is a fair process unless we've at least gone through that proper iterative process in Parliament. And I would say, give the people a chance to think again. If they don't, that's up to them. But if they do, it's as well we know about it, because just imagine if the country has changed its mind and you take this decision and you railroad us out of the European Union. I mean, the bitterness that's going to cause for years to come is extraordinary. And by the way, I think if it does happen, I think if we do Brexit in these circumstances, we don't have a proper process in Parliament, we tumble out at the end of May, we don't have a proper process in Parliament, we don't put it back to the people, I honestly think you'll find at the next general election, whenever that comes, and I'm not sure the form this will take, but I think people are going to want to sweep away those who are responsible for this. I really do. I think there'll be an enormous reckoning and retribution.
And what do you make of the DUP's position?
The one thing I've never understood is why, if you're a unionist, you're in favour of Brexit. I mean, Brexit is a dagger aimed at the heart of the union. Because for the first time you split the status of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, from their relationship with Europe. You split it for the first time. That border becomes a hard border, necessarily. I mean, you can soften it by the measures that you take, but it's bound to lead to a difficulty. And, one of the things I think is strangest about this whole process is how anybody who believes in the union, I do believe in the union, could think that Brexit's a good idea for Northern Ireland or indeed for Scotland. I mean, I'm not saying that you'll end up with a united Ireland if we do Brexit, but or that Scotland leaves the UK. I hope neither happens. But for sure, you've given those who want a united Ireland and those who want a separate Scotland, you've given them a huge argument, haven't you? Because you've said, You know, if you want a future with Europe, you're going to have to leave the UK to have it. So this is, I've never understood why the Unionists would support Brexit. It's, and, you know, therefore, to be fair to them, they are holding to their point of principle, and by their own lights, they should. But I think they have to recognise that if they want to protect that border and keep it open, you know, the best way to do that, frankly, is for us to stay.
One final question. Globalisation, can you ever really sell it again to the Western public? Can it ever be popular, given the amount of pain that people have felt in the last decade or so since the 2008 crisis? People have seen that as the enemy across the Western world. You've got a global institute which obviously aimed at trying to resurrect or promote the values of globalisation and the benefits of it. Do you think that over time, the long view, people are going to come back to that, or do you think it's broken now? It's just impossible to sell it?
No, I think 100% they'll come back to it if you give them proper leadership. Because, by the way, globalisation, it's not decided by governments. You know, there's all this nonsense about when people say, oh, you know, the Blair government was a neoliberal government. I mean, it's ridiculous. With the largest public investment the country's ever seen in public services, you know, we introduced all sorts of changes to labour market regulation, like the minimum wage and so on. We were in favour of an open economy and an internationalist position from the country because it's the right thing in the self-interest of the country. And in the end, globalization's a force driven by people. You know, the social media and the internet brings us together. Migration brings us together. Travel brings us together. You know, the world the world benefits from opening up. The question is, how do you deal with the injustice that can arise from that? Because obviously change always can create losers, but that's the thing that government should concentrate on. How do you make sure that you invest in those communities that can get left behind, invest in the people that might get left behind? But the answer to that is infrastructure, education, you know, proper skills. It's about, you know, providing help from government in order to revitalize areas, let their economies adjust and rebuild. This is the way to do it. But if we end up being anti-globalization in the West, we'll make an historic mistake. Because, by the way, we won't stop it, we'll just slow it down. And there's a whole other part of the world that isn't going to play that game with us. I mean, take China. Why have they lifted more people out of poverty than any country has ever done before in human history? Because they opened up. You know, why is India going to become one of these great global powers? Because they started to reform back in the 90s. They're doing more reform now. If they carry on reforming and opening up and dealing with their bureaucracy, the country will succeed. If it doesn't, it won't. So, you know, why is the fastest improving governance anywhere in the world has been those countries in Eastern Europe that have joined the European Union? Because they've joined a big political union and trading area. You know, in the end, tell me the country that's benefited from shutting its economy off. No one has. Globalization is going to happen. Of course it's got displacement effects, and this technology revolution, as I say, is going to have massive displacement effects. Deal with them, but don't try and stop it happening, because you won't, and B, you'll make huge policy mistakes along the way in trying. So, you know, in the end, I've got absolutely no doubt there will be a revival of the type of politics that I represented. The question is, you know, how fast do we get there, and do we have to experiment with populism of right or left, neither of which are any good at providing answers? They're only good at riding the anger.
Brilliant. Tony Woe, thanks very much.